They've walked free too many times today. These corrupt cops strut into the courtroom confident they'll beat the system once again. But what they don't know, a woman they've ignored for months has been watching their every move, and she's about to drop a truth bomb that will shatter their world. When the evidence is revealed, will justice finally be served, or will the corrupt find a way to slip through the cracks once more? What do you think? Will these officers finally face the consequences, or will they escape again? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This story will shock you, because once you learn the truth, you'll never look at corruption the same way again. Let's dive in. Brinkhaven wasn't always like this. It used to be the kind of place where neighbors looked out for one another, a town where kids rode their bikes freely, and local officers were part of the community, not above it. People believed in the system. They trusted the badge, but that was before the fear, before the silence. Now Brinkhaven is a place where doors are locked before sundown, where families lower their voices when speaking about the police, where a simple traffic stop could mean the difference between making it home or becoming another name on a growing list of unsolved cases. No one trusts the police anymore. No one dares to, because in Brinkhaven, speaking out doesn't just get you in trouble, it gets you erased. Ethan Kowalski was once a good cop, or at least that's what people thought. He knew how to wear the mask, how to shake hands and smile when needed, but beneath that polished exterior, he was something else entirely. A man who didn't enforce the law, but owned it. Brinkhaven was his kingdom, and he ruled it with power, money, and fear. He decided who walked free and who rotted behind bars. He made sure criminals who paid their dues to him stayed in business, while those who stepped out of line were either arrested or buried. His wealth grew overnight, not from his paycheck, but from dirty money. Drug deals, protection rackets, hush payments. He didn't just take bribes, he designed the entire system to run on them. But every king needs an enforcer, someone to make sure people stayed in line. And that's where Darren Reese came in. Reese was more than just a cop. He was Kowalski's fixer, his enforcer, his attack dog. If Kowalski wanted someone intimidated, Reese made sure they were afraid to sleep at night. If a witness became a problem, Reese made sure they didn't make it to trial. They said he had a file full of commendations for bravery. But the people of Brinkhaven knew the truth. He was just as dangerous as the criminals he claimed to be fighting. One time, a local journalist started digging too deep. He wrote a few articles about missing evidence, unexplained wealth among the officers. The next morning, his car was found torched outside his apartment. A few weeks later, he left town. Another time, a store owner refused to pay protection money. 2 days later, his shop caught fire. The police report called it an accident, but everyone knew Reyes didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. His job was simple: keep people afraid. And it worked. Not everyone in the department was like them. Jessica Mallory had joined the force with a different vision. She believed in justice and doing the right thing. She had looked up to Kay, once believed he was the kind of leader she wanted to follow. That belief didn't last long. The first time she questioned why a case against a powerful businessman was suddenly dropped, she was told to stop asking questions. The second time she noticed that drug money kept disappearing from evidence lockers, she got a warning. The third time she saw Darren Reese beat a suspect nearly to death in an alley and was told to write it up as self-defense. She wanted to believe it was just one bad officer, that the system wasn't broken, just bent. But as the months passed, the truth became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just one bad officer, it was the whole damn department. And Jessica, she had a choice: fall in line like everyone else or risk becoming the next person to disappear. Brinkhaven was no longer a town, it was a prison. The people knew the rules: stay quiet, look the other way, never cross the police, because anyone who didn't last long. Some tried. A few brave souls stood up, spoke out, but one by one they either left town or ended up in accidents. No one dared to fight back anymore. At least that's what Kowalski and Reese believed, because what they didn't know, what none of them realized, was that someone was already inside their walls, watching, listening, waiting. And when the moment was right, when they least expected it, everything they built would come crashing down. But the real question is, will anyone inside the department have the courage to turn against Kowalski before it's too late? The people of Brinkhaven knew corruption ruled their town, but what they didn't know, what even the dirtiest officers in the department hadn't realized, was that someone was already working to tear it all down. Someone who had walked among them for months, someone they overlooked, dismissed, ignored. Her name was Tiana Rosewood. By all appearances, Tiana was no one special, just another quiet employee in the records department at the Brinkhaven courthouse. She wasn't a judge, wasn't a lawyer, she wasn't even a clerk who handled high-profile cases. No, her role was even smaller, an assistant in the archives responsible for filing paperwork, organizing case files, and ensuring that old reports didn't get lost in the system. She was invisible, and that was exactly what she needed to be, because behind the neatly pressed blouses and the stacks of files, behind the polite nods and the soft, unassuming presence, Tiana Rosewood was something far more dangerous than any of them could have imagined. She wasn't a simple courthouse employee, she was an undercover FBI agent, and her mission to dismantle the Brinkhaven Police Department from the inside. Every day she sat at her desk flipping through legal documents, arrest records, and case reports. On the surface, she was just doing her job, cataloging old files, processing paperwork, keeping everything in order. But beneath the surface, she was looking for cracks, patterns, discrepancies, evidence that shouldn't exist, or worse, evidence that had mysteriously disappeared. Brinkhaven's corruption wasn't just a rumor, it was written in incorporated court documents, altered missing reports, cases that should have led to convictions, but somehow ended in dismissals. Every piece of paper she touched was a potential key to unraveling the entire operation. Most people wouldn't notice the inconsistencies, but Tiana wasn't most people. She had spent years studying criminals who thought they were untouchable, and she knew that the bigger the lie, the harder it was to keep clean. Somewhere in this sea of forged documents and falsified police reports, there was a thread that would unravel everything. She just had to find it. But Brinkhaven's corruption wasn't just buried in files, it was in the silence of the courthouse hallways, where employees had long since learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. It was in the forced smiles of prosecutors who knew their hands were tied, who had stopped fighting cases they knew they'd never win. It was in the fear that clung to every conversation, in the way people hesitated before saying a name out loud. The system was broken, everyone knew it, but no one dared to fix it, no one except her. And as Tiana carefully sifted through the records, tracking every hidden deal and buried case, she knew one thing for certain: she was running out of time, because in a town like Brinkhaven, secrets didn't stay hidden forever. The diner was nearly empty, the air thick with the scent of burnt coffee and stale grease. A flickering neon sign buzzed softly against the silence of the night. Tiana sat in a booth near the back, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She wasn't here for a late-night meal, she was here for the truth. Kevin Cross slid into the seat across from her, his movements stiff, his eyes scanning the room before settling on her. He looked different tonight, worn down, restless, like a man carrying a secret too heavy to hold. He didn't waste time on small talk. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a plain manila envelope, placing it carefully between them. "This," he murmured, tapping the envelope once, "is the proof you've been looking for." Tiana took it, her pulse steady, but her grip firm. She slid out a single photograph, grainy, low residential resolution, but damning. 2 Brinkhaven officers, a warehouse, a bag of confiscated evidence being exchanged like a business transaction, and in the background, barely visible under the dim overhead light, Ethan Kowalski. Bribery, corruption, a direct link between the police department and organized crime. Tiana's stomach tightened. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice calm despite the weight of what she was holding. Kevin hesitated. "A source, someone who wants this to end as badly as we do," he exhaled sharply, glancing toward the diner's entrance. "But if I have this, that means Kowalski knows someone else does too." A chill settled in her chest. "You need to be careful," she warned. "If they think you, they already know." For the first time, Kevin's mask of composure cracked, his hands fisted on the table. "They've been watching me, Tiana. My apartment was searched, my car's been followed." This, he motioned toward the envelope, "this is a kill order." Silence stretched between them. Tiana's instinct screamed at her to tell him to leave town, to run, but she knew better. There was no running from people like Kowalski. Kevin let out a shaky breath, his fingers drumming once against the table before he stood. "You keep it. If anything happens to me, this doesn't disappear." Tiana met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them, a silent promise Then without another word Kevin turned and walked out the door. She should have stopped him, should have said something, but she didn't. And that was the last time she ever saw Kevin cross alive. The records room was quiet, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and stale ink, rows of metal filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers packed with decades of police reports, court rulings, and case files most long forgotten. But Tiana Rosewood wasn't interested in old cases. She sat at her desk, eyes scanning a report labeled closed to anyone passing by. She was just another overworked records assistant drowning in paperwork. But in reality, she was hunting, searching for discrepancies, cross-referencing details, tracking down evidence that should have never gone missing. She had been careful, never requesting too many files at once, never drawing attention to herself. But tonight something felt off. She could feel it, that prickling sensation on the back of her neck, like someone was watching. Slowly, deliberately, she flipped the page in front of her. She forced her breathing to stay even, but her pulse it was shimmering because she was right. Someone was watching across the room, standing near the doorway. Jessica Mallory's eyes were locked on her. At first Jessica hadn't given much thought to the quiet woman in the archives, but then she started noticing things, little things. Why was a low-level records assistant requesting police reports on high-profile cases? Why did she seem so interested in fill that had already been marked as resolved? And why did she always close her laptop the second someone walked by? Jessica had been a cop long enough to recognize patterns, and Tiana's behavior wasn't adding up. She hadn't said anything to Kowalski or Reese yet, not without proof, but she was watching closely, and Tiana knew it. Tiana took a calculated risk and glanced up. Jessica was still there, her arms crossed, expression unreadable, not accusing, not confronting, just observing. It was the kind of look a cop gives when they don't have enough to make an arrest, but they know something isn't right. Their eyes met for a split second. Tiana debated her next move. Then she did the only thing she could. She smiled, a harmless, polite, nothing to see here kind of smile. Jessica didn't smile back. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, lips pressed into a thin line, calculating, considering. Then, after a long pause, she turned and walked away, but not before one last glance over her shoulder, a warning, a challenge. Tiana let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the edges of the file in front of her that had been too close. Jessica wasn't stupid. If she hadn't already started digging, she would soon, and once she did, Tiana wouldn't just be an anonymous records assistant anymore. She would be a threat, and in Brinkhaven threats didn't last long. The tension had been building for days. Tiana could feel it, the way Jessica's eyes lingered on her a little too long, the way she always seemed to be in the same hallway, the same room, the same quiet space that should have been empty. It wasn't a coincidence. Jessica Mallory was watching her, and tonight she was done just watching. The courthouse hallways were nearly empty, the soft hum of overhead lights buzzing in the silence. Most employees had gone home for the night, but Tiana remained seated at her desk, flipping through another case file she wasn't supposed to be looking at. Then came the sound of footsteps, deliberate, unhurried, stopping just behind her. Tiana didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Working late again. Jessica's voice was smooth, but there was an edge beneath it, one that hadn't been there before. Tiana looked up, keeping her expression neutral. Somebody has to keep this place organized. Jessica didn't smile. She didn't move either. She just stood there, arms crossed over her chest, studying Tiana like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Tiana set her pen down, tilting her head slightly. Something on your mind? Jessica leaned against the desk, her fingers drumming idly on the wood. You know, I was thinking about something today, a weird little pattern I've started noticing. Oh yeah, Jessica said. See, I've been working in this courthouse for a while now, long enough to know which cases matter, which files get looked at, which ones don't. And you, she lifted an eyebrow, you seem very interested in files that have already been closed. Tiana forced a small chuckle. Well, I like to be thorough. Jessica didn't laugh. She didn't blink either. She just watched, waiting for the first time. Tiana knew this wasn't just suspicion anymore. Jessica had seen too much, but she hadn't reported it, not yet. And that meant one thing. She wasn't sure. Jessica was standing at a crossroads. She could go to Kowalski, to Reese, to any of the corrupt officers in this department and raise the alarm, but she hadn't. Because a part of her was hesitating, a part of her deep down was starting to question the system. She had sworn to protect. Tiana needed to buy time. I don't know what you think I'm doing, "But I promise you I'm just doing my job," she said, keeping her voice even casual. Jessica tilted her head, studying her for a long moment before she finally pushed off the desk. Maybe that was all she said. Then she turned and walked away, but Tiana didn't relax, not yet, because this wasn't over. Jessica was still watching. And now the only question was, when she finally made her choice, whose side would she be on? The courthouse was a fortress of justice, or at least it was supposed to be. Outside, chaos brooded. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed like bursts of lightning, and protesters filled the sidewalks, some demanding accountability, others waving signs in support of the officers on trial. But inside it was different. The air was thick with something heavier than anticipation. It was the kind of silence that didn't just hold the weight of expectation, it carried the weight of certainty, because Ethan Kowalski believed he had already won. He walked through the courthouse doors as if he were arriving at a banquet in his honor. His uniform was crisp, his posture unshaken, and his smirk unapologetic. Behind him, Darren Reed, Brian O'Connor, and Heather Mullery followed, their expressions blank, their movements disciplined. But Kowalski was different. There was no fear in his eyes, no tension in his steps. This wasn't a trial. This was a formality, a show the public needed to see before the system. His system swept the accusations away, just like it always did for years. Kowalski had bent the law, twisted the system, buried the truth before it could see daylight. Today would be no different. He had the best attorneys money could buy. The real power players weren't in this courtroom. They were the ones pulling the strings behind it. And so, as he stepped into the chamber, he smiled, because in his mind this wasn't the day stood trial. This was the day he proved once and for all that justice in Brinkhaven was nothing more than an illusion. Across the room, District Attorney Elizabeth Calder gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had spent months building this case, brick by brick, fact by fact, and now she was watching it unravel before it had even begun. Because this morning, before she stepped foot in the courthouse, she got the call, a voice smooth, calm, and dripping with quiet authority. A warning: drop the case, Miss Calder, for your own good. No threats, no demands, just a simple statement of fact, a reminder that this case wasn't just about corrupt cops anymore. This was bigger, deeper, darker. And if she pushed forward, they wouldn't just take her job, they'd take everything. She wanted to believe she could fight it, that if she pushed hard enough, if she screamed the truth loud enough, justice would prevail. But now, sitting in this courtroom, watching Kowalski's unwavering smirk, watching the quiet nods exchanged between the judge and defense team, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Doubt, the kind that starts small, a whisper in the back of your mind, and then it grows. Because what if the system was never meant to work? From across the courtroom, Kowalski watched her. He could see it in her face, the way her fingers tightened around her pen, the way her shoulders slumped just enough for him to notice. He knew that look, the look of someone who had already lost. And that's when he knew this case was already dead. So when the judge entered, when the courtroom settled, when the trial officially began, Kowalski leaned back in his chair, relaxed, confident, waiting for Calder to fold, waiting for the system to do what it had always done, protect him, waiting for this case to die just like all the others before it, because justice didn't exist in Brinkhaven, power did. And for years Ethan Kowalski had been the one holding it. What none of them knew, the game was about to change. The trial was enfoing. The courtroom air was dense, thick with anticipation. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters, town officials, Springhaven citizens who had long since stopped believing in justice, but showed up anyway, hoping today might be different. At the prosecution's table, Elizabeth Calder sat stiff, her jaw clenched, her mind racing. She had expected Kowalski to be arrogant, expected him to sit there, smirking, knowing the system was rigged in his favor. But what she hadn't expected was just how far he was willing to go, because right now Ethan Kowalski was playing his trump card. And he was doing it with a smile. Kowalski's lawyer stood, buttoning his expensive suit, as he stepped toward the bench. Your Honor, he said smoothly, his voice confident, rehearsed. The defense would like to submit new evidence that proves my client's innocence beyond a shadow of a doubt. Calder's stomach twisted. New evidence? That wasn't possible. She had gone over every file, every report. There was nothing that could exonerate him, unless her heart pounded as the lawyer handed a folder to the judge, then turned, grinning directly at her. We have contained a series of police reports and signed affidavits from key witnesses, who now confirm that not only was my client not involved in any criminal activity, but that these accusations stem from a deep-rooted attempt to defame and discredit decorated officer of the law. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The judge skimmed the papers, nodding slightly. This is serious evidence, Miss Calder, he said, looking up at her. How do you respond? Calder's hands curled into fists. She already knew what was inside that folder. She hadn't seen it before, but she knew it would be witness statements conveniently contradicting everything she had built, reports filled with manufactured details, timelines, altered, fabricated surveillance footage, maybe even a sworn statement from an informant claiming Kowalski was framed. A mountain of lies disguised as truth, and the worst part, it looked real. Kowalski turned his head ever so slightly, catching her gaze. And then he smiled, not just a smirk, a knowing grin, the kind that said, I told you, you can't touch me. Then, as if this were nothing more than a minor inconvenience, he leaned forward, folded his hands, and chuckled, actually chuckled, as if the entire courtroom was just a stage, and he was the director pulling the strings. Miss Calder, his lawyer, continued, it's becoming increasingly clear that this case is built on misinterpretations, misunderstandings, and frankly reckless accusations. Another pause. Another smirk, or perhaps, the lawyer added, tilting his head, a personal vendetta. A wave of murmurs filled the room. The judge tapped his gavel twice. Order. But the damage was done. All eyes were on Elizabeth Calder now, watching, waiting. Would she crumble? Would she fold under the pressure like so many before her? Kowalski was counting on it. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of ease, as if the entire case was a joke to him, because to him it was. He had seen this play before. The evidence was strong. Yes, but evidence didn't mean anything when the game was already rigged, and in Brinkhaven the game had always been his to control. What he couldn't see was that, for the first time, the script wasn't his to write anymore. The courtroom had belonged to Kowalski for years. He had dictated how things played out, who won, who lost, who disappeared, and today was supposed to be just another victory with his carefully crafted false evidence in play, and his lawyer controlling the narrative. He was already seeing the headlines in his mind. Heroic officer vindicated, another case buried, another win for him. And then the doors swung open. The sharp click of heels echoed through the silent chamber, slow, controlled, unshaken. All heads turned, and there she was, a woman in a perfectly tailored black suit, her posture upright, her face unreadable, exuding the kind of power that demanded attention without a single word. Tiana Rosewood, but not as the quiet, unassuming records assistant people had ignored for months, not as the invisible courthouse worker. No, she was something else entirely. The quiet gasps from the gallery, the murmurs of uncertainty, the way even the judge hesitated, unsure of what was about to unfold, it all led to a single unavoidable moment. Kowalski's smirk faded for the first time today. He didn't look so sure anymore. Tiana stepped forward, her heels striking against the polished floor, her movements precise, controlled, like a woman who had been waiting for this moment. The entire courtroom held its breath. She stopped at the prosecution's table. Elizabeth Calder looked up at her, stunned. Then Calder turned to the judge and spoke, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in the room. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce a key figure in this investigation. A pause, the kind that pulls everything taut, like a string about to snap. Then Special Agent Tiana Rosewood of the FBI. The words landed like a gunshot. A ripple of shock spread through the room. A collective gasp. But the only reaction that mattered, the only one Tiana had been waiting for, was Kowalski's. His fingers twitched against the table, a muscle in his jaw tightened for a split second, just a second. His mask slipped, the air shifted, because he knew this wasn't a formality anymore. This wasn't his game. This was something else entirely. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Kowalski wasn't sure how it was going to end. The courtroom was silent, not the kind of silence that felt calm, but the kind that hung in the air like a storm. Heavy and suffocating. Tiana stood at the prosecution's table, steady, unmoving. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. This was it, the moment Ethan Kowalski's world collapsed. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small, unremarkable black flash drive. Nothing special, nothing flashy, but deadly. She held it up. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear, strong, unshakable. The prosecution would like to present key evidence obtained during a federal investigation into the Brinkhaven police department. The judge adjusted his glasses. Proceed. Tiana plugged the drive into the courtroom's audio system. She pressed play, and Kowalski's voice filled the room. Look, if you want things to run smooth, you know how it works. A pause, the sound of ice clinking in a glass, a slow exhale. You pay. We look the other way. No stops, no interference, no problems. Another pause, then his voice lower, colder. But if I find out you're holding out on me, if you try to get smart, you know what happens. The courtroom erupted. Gasped, shocked whispers, reporters scrambling to jot down notes, fingers flying across phone screens. A defense attorney shot to his feet. Objection. This could have been doctored. There's no way to verify. Tiana lifted a single finger. Not yet. Because there was more, much more. Tiana pulled out a phone, worn edges cracked along the side. The last thing Kevin Cross ever recorded. She set it on the table with deliberate care, as if honoring its weight not just in plastic and metal but in truth. She tapped the screen. The video began, and the entire courtroom watched the lie unravel. The footage was dark, grainy, a shaky frame, heavy breathing. Kevin's voice low, urgent. I don't know if this will ever see the light of day, but if it does, I need you to know the truth. A sudden movement in the shadows, a man on his knees, hands raised. Please, I didn't do anything. A gunshot, a single deafening burst of light. The man fell. 4 officers stood over him, unmoved, unshaken. One of them, Darren Reese, spat on the ground, moved the body. Nobody saw anything. The screen cut to black, and then Kevin's final words. This is how they do it. This is how they've always done it. For a full 5 seconds nobody spoke, nobody moved. Then chaos. The gallery erupted. Reporters shouted. A juror covered their mouth in horror. The judge hammered his gavel, demanding order. Tiana didn't flinch. She turned and locked eyes with Kowalski. For the first time, he wasn't smirking. For the first time, he had no words. His fingers curled into fists, knuckles white, his jaw tightened, desperate, cornered. He opened his mouth, maybe to deny, maybe to protest, but nothing came out, because he knew the game was over. The system he had controlled, the lies he had built, the power he had wielded, it had all just collapsed. Tiana stepped closer, lowered her voice, made sure he was the only one who heard. Not so untouchable now. Are you? Kowalski's world had just burned to the ground, and Tiana Rosewood, she was the one holding the match. For a man who had spent his entire life untouchable, this was impossible, unthinkable. Ethan Kowalski had controlled Brinkhaven for years. He had pulled the strings, silenced the threats, buried the evidence. The law bent for him, not the other way around. But now, he was trapped. And he knew it. The courtroom was chaos, people shouting, reporters scrambling, the judge's jail slamming down, demanding order. But Kowalski, he wasn't listening, couldn't. His mind was racing, grasping for an exit, a way out, but there wasn't one, not this time. His empire was crumbling around him, and for the first time in his life, he felt something he had never truly felt before, fear. And then instinct took over. Kowalski shoved back his chair so hard it crashed to the floor. In a blur of movement, he lunged, not toward his lawyer, not toward Tiana, toward the exit. Gasps erupted as Kowalski bolted toward the courtroom doors. It was pure survival, no thought, no strategy, just desperation. He barreled through the aisle, knocking over a spectator in his path. A woman shrieked. A reporter stumbled back, their camera crashing to the floor. All around him, people froze in shock, because this wasn't the confident, untouchable man they had feared for years. This was a rat, cornered and frantic, and just as his hand reached for the door, a voice cut through the madness. Stop him. The words barely registered before a figure moved, a dark blur. FBI agents closing, and Kowalski barely made it 2 more steps before he was hit hard. A tackle straight to his torso, driving him into the ground. His body slammed against the polished courtroom floor with a brutal, resounding thud. Groans of protest ripped from his throat as multiple hands pinned him down, wrists twisted, cold metal snapped shut, handcuffs, his own, the same kind he had slapped onto innocent people. Without a second thought, the irony was suffocating. Fury burned in his eyes as he thrashed, struggling against the weight of the agents. This is a goddamn setup, he spat, voice wild, desperate. This is, you can't do this to me. I own this town. Tiana stepped forward, looking down at him, calm, unshaken. Not anymore, she said. And just like that, his reign was over as they hauled Kowalski to his feet, his breath ragged, his face red with rage. Tiana felt the weight of what had just happened. For years, Brinkhaven had been choking under corruption, and today justice had won. But deep down a question lingered: was this truly the end, or was Kowalski just one piece of a much larger puzzle because men like him didn't act alone? And if there was one thing she had learned, it was that corruption doesn't die easily. The courthouse doors burst open. The people of Brinkhaven had been waiting for this moment for years. They had lived under the weight of fear, watching their town sink deeper into corruption. They had whispered in back alleys, exchanged nervous glances whenever a police cruiser passed by. But today, they saw justice with their own eyes. Kowalski and his officers were dragged out in handcuffs, their badges stripped, their power gone. Reporters shoved microphones forward, snapping pictures capturing the downfall of men who once thought they were untouchable. A cheer erupted from the crowd, a roar of triumph. Some wept, relief washing over them in waves. Others hugged, their voices lost in the noise of celebration. Justice for the first time in a long time. Brinkhaven felt hope. Tiana stood at the courthouse steps watching it all unfold. She should have felt victorious. She should have felt relieved, but instead, she felt something else, something cold, a whisper of doubt nagging at the edges of her mind. And then her phone rang. She hesitated for only a second before answering. Static, a pause, then a voice, deep, calm, amused. You think you've won? A chill ran down her spine. The crowd around her faded into background noise. The voice continued, smooth as silk. This was just the tip of the iceberg. Tiana's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? She demanded, but she already knew whoever they were. They weren't bluffing. A low chuckle. Enjoy your victory, Agent Rosewood. A click. Silence. Tiana lowered the phone slowly, her heartbeat steady, but her instinct screaming because she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Somewhere far from the courthouse, beyond the flashing cameras and cheering crowds, a man sat in a dimly lit room. His face was hidden in the shadows. The glow of the city skyline flickered against the glass as he lifted a crystal glass of whiskey to his lips, taking a slow sip. The phone on his desk still buzzed softly from the ended call. He smirked, unbothered, unrattled, because Kowalski was just a pawn, and Tiana Rosewood had just stepped onto a much bigger chessboard. As Tiana gazed at the phone in her hand, the weight of the battle ahead settling in, one question echoed in her mind: who was really pulling the strings? Because in Brinkhaven, justice wasn't just something you won, it was something you had to fight for every single day, and the war, it had only just begun.